Hello, and welcome back to another exciting edition of Lectures on Lacan. Our topic this time around is this wild and woolly essay, L'étourdi, which we don't translate into English. It's tricky to translate, but it's hardly impossible to render, and I think that's what we're going to discover about this essay. Yeah, it's hard to read, but it's hardly impossible to make your way through this, especially if you've been ramping up to this essay by reading Lacan's seminars prior to it, as we've been doing in Lectures on Lacan. After reading the first quarter of this admittedly challenged and challenging essay, and that's all I've read, by the way. I just read the first 30 pages in the packet that we have of this bilingual version of the text. So I'm about a quarter of the way through. I don't know what the hell's going to happen next. But having arrived at this point, here is what I am inclined to offer as a translation of its title, L'étourdi. And you can see it spelled out, and you can see how Lacan is messing with it. I would read this as the forgetful said. The forgetful said. I think that's useful, at least here now that I find myself 25% of the way through this bad boy. The essay, as I'm sure you've discovered, picks up exactly where Lacan left off in Seminar 19B, or worse. I say Seminar 19B because, as you know, there was another seminar across town that he was delivering, Seminar 19A, we call it, on the psychoanalyst knowledge. We have lecture series on both. The previous series to this one was on Seminar 19B, or worse, as you probably know, and the one before that was on Seminar 19A, the psychoanalyst knowledge, both available to you. The theme on which he ends Seminar 19B, or worse, just weeks before embarking on this essay, was the body particularly in analytic experience. And three aspects of this in particular. This is where we find ourselves at the start of L'étourdi and at the end of Seminar 19B, just before it, with these three aspects of the body in analytic experience. First, the castration of the analysand. There's that barred S, that slashed S, that we see so often in Lacan's algebra. Second, crucially, the abjection of the analyst. Here's that little a in the analytic discourse. So you take a look at the analytic discourse. In the top left, you see objet a. This is the little a of abjection. Don't get it twisted. Abjection, a state of embodied abject experience that the analyst occupies. And on the right, as addressee, you see the castrated analysand. Here, this barred subject. And then what you have in analytic experience is their one-on-one encounter, an encounter in analysis, an encounter that Lacan specifies at the end of or worse, in corps. Sounds like encore in the French. En, new word, corps. It means in body, but it also sounds like encore, meaning still, meaning again, meaning more. As we noted in our final lecture on Seminar 19B, the encore here is twofold. Encore in the sense of in person, in body. Analysis is something that occurs in person, between two bodies. But also encore in the sense of again and again, repeatedly, more and more. The type of bodily experience that Lacan has in mind is one in which castrated analysands encounter abject analysts and do so in corps, encore, in body and again and again. And here's where we came down on this matter. You can go back and review the final lectures of our series on or worse. They're totally there for you. Here's where we wound up with it all. In order for the clinical practice of Lacanian psychoanalysis to flourish, analysts must find their place, know their place in the analytic discourse. And they must do so encore, not only in person, in body, but also, crucially, again and again, from one session to the next, one analysand to the next. And it's ultimately a place, let me remind you, of abjection. In the age of telemedicine, which is also our age, Lacan reminds us that being there with each other, castrated analysand and abject analyst, matters more, not less. But let me be clear, by way of review and ramp up, this is no mean feat. All too often, the analysand who embraces castration meets with an analyst who resists abjection. Instead of allowing their function to be that of the object supposed to go, as I've put it, the analyst clings to their status as the subject supposed to know. Another construction I'm sure you're familiar with. Rather than accepting and even willing their own abjection, the analyst opts to play professor instead. With so many diplomas on their wall, so many books on their shelves, so many markers of cultural and linguistic capital carefully arranged around their office. Can you blame them? Who could blame them? I can't blame them. Lacan certainly doesn't. It's only too understandable, he tells us at the end of his iconic 19th seminar, 19B in this case. And all further proof, I would add by way of recalling where we ended our last series, that the central resistance of analytic experience is not that of the analysand. The central resistance of analytic experience is that of the analyst, and it is a resistance to abjection. We've been there. We've already discussed this. It will prove crucial as we start getting into Lacanian. Now, before considering what happens when things go right and the analyst is able to overcome this resistance to abjection, I want to ask the opposite question. What happens when the analyst's resistance to abjection gets the better of them? In brief, because we've covered this before, let me put it like this. Here's what happens when the analyst's resistance to abjection gets the better of them. The discourse of the analyst devolves into that of the university, and the analysand's embodied act of speaking in the clinic slips into oblivion behind a wall of supposed understanding, extending from what the analysand has said to what the analyst has heard. Now, if you got ears to hear something more in all of this, it better damn well be the sentence that Lacan kept writing on the board in 1972. The same sentence with which he begins Topology and circles back around the following year in Seminar 20. Seminar 20, the title of which, let me remind you, is Encore. This is a sentence that Lacan is writing on the blackboard at the start of his final lessons from Seminar 19B or worse. It's one of two sentences, in fact. He carries those sentences forward into Topology. They are the founding sentences if you will, of this important essay. And you also see them popping up in Seminar 20. This ain't no regular sentence. You can see it on page 4 of the bilingual text of Latour-D that we're reading in this series. And it goes like this. The fact that one speaks remains forgotten behind what is said in what is heard. And if you're looking at the French, you know that heard could also suggest a presumed understanding as well. In a sense, the logic at work in this sentence is quite straightforward. Analyses go astray when analysts attempt to understand what their analysans have said, neglecting the fact that, as Lacan puts it, for what is said to be true, one must still say it. That there must first be an act of saying. Now, dear Lacanians, y'all make a big fuss about signifiers and signifieds. It's justified. Lacan was making a big fuss about this too earlier in his work. But here we are in 1972, and that shit ain't central. In 1972, the summer of 1972, with Lacan on the verge of his momentous 20th seminar, the key dyad here is not that of signifier and signified. Hear me now. But of saying and said. The embodied act of speaking and the linguistic grammatical effect of having said something. Saying and said. These are the pistons on which Latour-D is firing. Analysis goes astray when it centers on the latter and marginalizes the former. In other words, when the analyst attends to grammatical subjects apart from their enunciating counterparts, focusing on what analysans have said instead of on their acts of speaking. But we can't stop here. Indeed, we have yet to even begin working through this opening sentence in an essay that we have only begun to read, and the implications for this opening sentence on Lacanian theory and technique. But hold up. It's just one sentence, right? I know what you're thinking. It's just one sentence, man. We've got lots of sentences up in here. Why you got to focus on just one sentence? And you're right. You're correct, man. It's one measly little sentence. A scrap or a leftover from some shit that Lacan wrote on the blackboard in his previous seminar and didn't really say much about there. It's a leftover, a scrap, a fragment, or as Lacan describes it on page 3 of our text, a crumb. But he says it's a crumb that is not philosophical. Did you catch the reference here? It's to Søren Kierkegaard's work, but not to the book suggested by one of our translators. And Lord help me, when Kierkegaard starts popping up in these materials, well, if you've seen my first 2 books, you know they're basically an attempt on my part to finally let go of Kierkegaard. It took me 2 fucking books just to write my way out of Kierkegaard. Book 1 ends with him. Book 2 begins with him. And note in particular that the Chattering Mind, it ends with Lacan. Lacan was every bit my way out of Kierkegaard. But here we are at the start of this essay, and our boy is bringing up the Dane. I can't resist. I just want to note this for you really quick. Lacan makes this reference. He says, I'm just throwing some crumbs your way at the start of Latour-D. But they're not philosophical ones. These are absolutely references to Søren Kierkegaard's work in the mid-1840s. And forgive me for nerding out just a little bit here. In 1844, Kierkegaard publishes this book called Philosophical Fragments. And the Danish, I know at least one of you on this recording is going to be speaking Danish and thinking about this, smula. Fragments is smula in Danish, and it means crumbs. The better translation of what Kierkegaard is doing here would have been philosophical crumbs. It's a good-sized book, this Philosophical Fragments from 1844. I'm looking at like 400 pages. It's upwards of 400 pages. This is no tiny book. But check it out. 2 years later, in 1846, Kierkegaard publishes, and I love this title, Concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments. It's the postscript. 2 years later, he publishes a postscript, a concluding unscientific postscript to Philosophical Crumbs. And this motherfucker is massive. Utterly brilliant, and one of the key works to read if you're trying to get into the work of Søren Kierkegaard. It also comes in 2 volumes, mind you. Volume 1, the English translation, 600 plus pages. Volume 2, the English translation, over 300 pages. So pay attention to what's happening here. Lacan is referring to some crumbs from Søren Kierkegaard's work that number well over 1,000 pages. I'm talking 1,300 pages in total of crumbs, but they are separated. Philosophical crumbs and the concluding unscientific postscript to philosophical crumbs. Now, why am I fucking with all this? Not just because I leap at any opportunity to discuss my boy Søren Kierkegaard, but because it's fundamental to understanding what you're getting into when you start reading L'Étourdi. If Seminar 19b, or worse, was Lacan's Philosophical Fragments, L'Étourdi was his concluding unscientific postscript to this seminar. Now, what does that mean? It means that you've got a 2-volume, 900-page pile of psychoanalytic crumbs condensed into, when it was originally published, a 50-page essay. A 50-page essay that begins with a deceptively straightforward sentence, the first of 2 substantial crumbs. The fact of speaking remains forgotten behind what is said in what is heard. This is a sentence which Lacan goes on to write as taking on a certain sense when studied in terms of psychoanalytic discourse. No sooner than he presents this sentence than he starts explaining what this might mean in terms of psychoanalytic discourse. He wants to talk about the sense that this sentence takes on in light of what we know about the psychoanalytic discourse. It's on page 5 of our text. You can check it out. And I think it's here, with this turn towards discourse, that we find a way in to L'Étourdi. Now, in order to grasp, or at least get our fingers on, what Lacan is up to here, I want to begin by recalling what you already know about his theory and topology of discourse, and his discourse of the analyst and the university in particular. First, a bit of review on his theory and topology of discourse. Now, you've seen this thing before. I'm not even sure I need to write it out for you. But if you're just listening, you can trace this thing out pretty readily. And you know the diagram I'm about to show you. You draw 2 horizontal lines right next to each other. And as you can hear, I'm doing it with you. Above the first line, the line to the left, you write agent. Above the line to the right, other. Below the line on the right, product. Below the line on the left, truth. Now, this is the basic element that goes into the production of a discourse, this four-footed animal. But there are vectors, arrows, causalities, causes and effects that run throughout this. Agents address others, and in so doing, produce certain effects. So there's an arrow running from agent to other and other down to product. And these products are almost always objects of surplus enjoyment for the agent that inaugurated the whole thing. And what of truth? Truth is the condition of possibility for that agent to speak in the first place. Now, there's more to say about this, but I want you to have on the page in front of you, or at least in your mind's eye, this four-footed animal that Lacan has been working with since Seminar 17. It's one we've been over a lot. The point I want to remind you of is the point that I always want to remind you of. Between truth and product, the lower elements in Lacan's topology of discourse, there is no vector. In Seminar 17, he draws a triangle there, a delta, he says, of impotence. What we have learned since is that this is every bit an impasse, a logical impasse, a barrier in every given discourse between truth and product, cause and effect in any given discourse. There is an impasse. It is a logical impasse. It is not just a site of impotence. It is also a field of logical impossibility. And this is what Lacan works up to in his report on or worse, the same report published at the back end of the English translation we just read in our last series. Why I'm queuing this up is because I want to remind you that also about this time, across town, in his other seminar on the psychoanalyst knowledge, Lacan introduces a fifth vector. So what you got so far is truth to agent, agent to other to product, and product back to agent. Here it is. If you're watching the video, you can see it. You got four vectors. What Lacan does in Seminar 19a, the psychoanalyst knowledge, and you can see this developed in our previous two series, is he adds a fifth vector from truth to other. I hold up the diagram again so that you can see it. This provides truth with another, albeit more indirect, path to the agent. And you can see it if you've got this in your mind's eye or you followed my lead and got out pen and paper and drawn it. Truth has a vector pointing to the other, has a vector pointing to product, has a vector pointing to agent. So you see a very interesting circuit being run here. From truth to other to product, back up to agent. And I draw it here with a blue marker so you can see how this thing flows. That fifth vector is key. It now shows the agent receiving two inputs from truth, one direct and one more indirect. This addition of a fifth vector in Lacan's theory and topology of discourse, which is always a matheme because it formulates an impasse, recall. It marks an especially significant advancement in the discourse of the analyst. In the analytic discourse, this addition of a fifth vector is key. So what I want to do is now transition to a drawing of the analytic discourse. And forgive me, because I'm sure you can just imagine this thing in your mind. For me, however, it's more helpful to draw it out. And I'm going to draw it out as Lacan is drawing it out here in the early 1970s. As you can hear, I'm labeling all four corners, and I'm adding the crucial vectors that link them all together. I hold up now for you to see the discourse of the analyst. Now, we can go through and rehearse some of this if you like. I know you've seen it before, but let's say it again, say it better. In the discourse of the analyst, what you see is a barred subject coughing up symptomatic expressions. There's the vector from barred subject down to S1. At the behest of an unconscious truth of which they are unaware. Now you see the arrow from S2 to barred subject to S1. The unconscious, here S2, commands the barred subject to speak. And when the barred subject speaks, what often pops up are symptomatic statements. That is S1. And then these symptomatic statements feed into the interpretive position of the analyst. There's that return arrow from symptom up to analyst. But note also, in the discourse of the analyst here, that S2 also has a direct arrow pointing to the position of the analyst as objet A. We've been over that before. We're going to rehearse it again here in a minute. But I want you to recall in your mind what's going on here. Objet A is receiving two inputs from the unconscious, one by way of the analysand and one by way of what we know as the analyst's supposed understanding of how the unconscious works. And throughout it all, don't you ever forget, between the two lower positions, there is no vector, but instead an impasse, here marked by a simple delta. We could go further. We could keep rehearsing, but I don't think we need to yet. In fact, I expect we're going to ramp right up to this thing in ways that are helpful. Let's get back, though, to that enigmatic, multifarious S2, because I think this one is worth rehearsing very carefully. As we've seen in our recent lecture series, this fifth vector from truth to other, S2 to barred subject in the discourse of the analyst, allows us to delineate two basic meanings of S2 in this discourse. The first, the one you just heard me describe, is S2 as the analyst's supposed knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. Here is that direct vertical arrow in the discourse from S2 to objet A. But that's not the only meaning of S2, and not the only aspect of it that will wind up in the analyst's lap. S2, as we've seen, also means the unconscious truths of which the analysand is unaware, and which command their symptomatic speech as a result. Here is the trajectory from S2 to barred subject to S1. So you've got these two aspects, these two faces of knowledge when it shows up in the position of truth in the discourse of the analyst. On the one hand, we're talking about the analyst's knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. But on the other hand, we're talking about the analysand's ignorance of their own unconscious truths. The unconscious truths of which the analysand is unaware and yet commanded by. In our series on or worse, this iconic 19th seminar, we pursued another line of inquiry extending from this insight that we've been scaling up. How is the analyst to handle these dual inputs the dual inputs from these two S2s, these two aspects of knowledge. The analyst's knowledge of the truth of the unconscious and the unconscious truths of which the analysand is unaware. They're both feeding in to the position of the analyst. And the question we've begun asking is, what the fuck are you supposed to do with that, dear analysts? How are you supposed to handle these two inputs, one arriving as knowledge of the truth of the unconscious and the other arriving as symptomatic expressions emitted by barred subjects at the behest of unconscious truths? This is ultimately a choice between two discourses. That of the university, guided by an analyst playing professor, and that of the analyst when its namesake embraces abjection. And for Lacan, the choice is even starker. It's not just a question of which discourse you choose, dear analyst. It's a question of whether you are a philosopher or a psychoanalyst. It's a question between philosophy and psychoanalysis. But hold up. I don't want to go that route. Let's stick with these discourses. It is arguably the breakthrough that marks the beginning of Lacan's later thought, these discourses. It's not the only one, but at this point, the discourses are truly a magnificent breakthrough in his thought. With these discourses, you know we've recalled a bit about the analytic discourse. Now let's talk a little bit about what you know about the university discourse. You can again write this thing out. You can write it out exactly as I did the other one. Here I go. I'm going to get a different marker. I'm going to get a different colored piece of paper, and we're going to do the exact same thing. Writing out the discourse of the university. In the position of agent, you have S2. In the position of other, you have objet A. In the position of product, you have barred subject. And in the position of truth, conditioning that agent's ability to speak, you have S1. And of course, you have a delta of impotence here between the barred subject and that S1, which is going to prove key. And because we want this to be as full as possible, I'm also adding the return arrows. This is what the discourse of the university looks like. We've been discussing it since our series on Seminar 17, so I won't review the entire damn thing here. What matters for us at the start of L'étourdi is that S2 over S1 on the side of the analyst turned professor. We've read this structuration several ways in the past. Here, I want to read it just a bit differently. When the analyst resists abjection, refusing to abandon their imaginary status as a subject supposed to know, their knowledge of the truth of the unconscious is allowed to trump and suppress the symptomatic expressions of the analysand. Their knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, S2, is allowed to trump and suppress the symptomatic expressions of the analysand, S1. That's why we see S2 over S1 in this formulation. Symptom becomes subordinate to knowledge when the clinic becomes a classroom. That's what we see on the left-hand side of Lacan's matheme for the university discourse. When the analyst cannot overcome their resistance to abjection and instead clings to their imaginary transferential status as a subject supposed to know, The discourse of the analyst gives way to that of the university, and the knowledge, the supposed expertise of the analyst begins to suppress the symptomatic expressions of the analysand. And that's what we see. That's one new way to read that S2 over S1. And I think we can assign some words to this. Lacan says that sentence needs to be drawn out in all of its senses through the psychoanalytic discourse. So let's go ahead and start adding some senses to all this. Symptom becomes subordinate to knowledge is the same as saying nonsense subordinate to sense. Hang tight with me on this one. I think it's going to pay off. Symptoms are nonsensical. And the sense in question here is the same word in French for meaning. The nonsensical symptoms that the analysand coughs up at the behest of unconscious truths of which they are ignorant is subordinate to the interpretive sense or meaning that the analyst, with all their knowledge and expertise on how the unconscious works, brings to their one-on-one encounter. That's an important part of what we're seeing here when the clinic degenerates into a classroom. The nonsensical symptoms that analysands cough up find themselves in a subordinate position to the interpretive sense or meaning that the analyst, with all their expertise, brings to their encounter. So this S2 over S1 in the university discourse, in analytic experience, what this looks like is sense over nonsense, knowledge over ignorance. The analyst's expertise over the analysand's stumbling, stammering, coughed up expressions. Sense, made of nonsense. Understanding, made of ignorance. This becomes the trajectory of analytic experience, and an existential trap like no other, and all because the analyst could not overcome their resistance to abjection, allowing their clinic to become a classroom and themselves to play teacher. But notice also the positions of symptom and analysand in the discourse that typifies this clinic turned classroom. I hold up again the university discourse. When this motherfucker sets into analysis, notice the position of the symptom, that S1, relative to the analysand, that barred subject, in this diagram. When the analytic discourse devolves into the university discourse, the vector of embodied speech between the barred subject and their symptomatic expressions, the barred subject, that slashed out S, and the S1 in the analytic discourse that I'm now showing you again, this vector disappears. Between them now, in the university discourse, between the barred subject and their symptomatic expressions, there is only a delta of impotence, which Lacan, at this point in his thought, now raises to the level of what he calls a logical impossibility. A logical impossibility that he tells us incarnates the real. Between embodied analysand, commanded by unconscious truth, and the symptomatic statements that they produce as a result, the same statements that our analyst turned professor subjects to knowledge and understanding, there is now nothing. No vector, no line of communication, just a big fucking hole. The act and the fact of saying, of speaking, and always encore is now external and exterior to, subtracted from analytic experience, or at least, as Lacan puts it, forgotten. So this is the important part. When the discourse of the analyst is turned and transformed into that of the university, and the clinic becomes a classroom, the act and the fact of saying, of speaking, the vector that connected the barred subject commanded by the unconscious to what they say, what they have said in the field of the symptom, is gone. It ain't there anymore. Now what we see is a logical impossibility. Not just a delta of impotence, a barrier that truly now functions as a logical impossibility. Between the barred subject and their symptomatic expression, there is no longer the act of speaking. It is indeed forgotten. Let me see if we can put this more sharply. Between the speaker and the spoken, the sayer and the said, the barred subject and their symptomatic statement, where the act of speaking and the fact of saying used to take place, we now find a radical disjunction, the function of which is neither sensible nor nonsensical, but instead absent. And I used that term with a bit of a caveat, because we're about to torque it in directions that I think it needs to go. This term absence, you know we're talking about sense here. We got sense and nonsense. I'm throwing a little absence in there as well. Absence is a combination of two Latin terms. Ab, meaning off or away from, and esse, meaning being. Abessa means to be away from, in space and or time. Absence denotes departure, separation, disjunction. Hold that etymological thought as we start toying with this word absence. I throw it out here now because I think some of the best readings of what Lacan is up to at this point in his thought, namely those of Alain Badiou, have made excellent use of the term absence here. Excellent, but also, I would add, incomplete. We will be giving them another turn here in a minute. From existence in the analytic discourse to existence in its university degeneration. This is what becomes of the analysand's act and fact of speaking. You see, in the analytic discourse, you can see the act of speaking. It exists right out here as the vector of speech between the analysand and their symptomatic statements. It absolutely exists in the analytic discourse. We're going to complicate that in a minute. Right now, I'm just showing you what happens when that discourse degenerates into that of the university, when the clinic devolves into the classroom. Because now, that act and fact of speaking, no longer is there a vector between them, as I hold up once more the discourse of the university for you. Now what we see is an act and fact of speaking that exists in a university degeneration. At stake here, in all of this, and let me be clear, the stake here is not the barred subject. I don't fucking care about the barred subject. That ain't what we're talking about here. And it's not exactly their symptomatic statements either. This is not about the slashed S or the S1 that you see in the discourse of the analyst. Instead, it's about the living, embodied event in and as which the latter emerges from the former. The symptom emerges from the barred subject. That's what is at stake at this point. Relative to the suppressed nonsense of the analysand's symptom and the sense made of it by the analyst's superior knowledge and interpretation, the analysand's living, embodied act of speaking remains absent, externalized, removed, and for all these reasons, impossible. That's why I'm using the university discourse to characterize this turn that happens when the analyst refuses to accept abjection. Because it shows that living, embodied act of speaking, the fact of speaking, being forgotten, dropping out. When Lacan raises impotence to impossibility in 1972, in this delta between truth and product in any given discourse, this is in part what he means to designate. Between sense and nonsense, knowledge and symptom, something drops out, slipping into oblivion and impossibility, into an existence that is neither sensible nor nonsensical, but instead absensical. Again, Badiou is good on this point. Maybe too good, maybe just a little too clean. There isn't enough crumb in what he's up to here, at least for my taste. And as a result, I think he misses the mark just a bit. Some crumbs do indeed matter. But all that aside for a second, let's just start with what we know. What can we say at this point? For our purposes, at this stage in the reading of L'étourdi, I'd like to suggest the following. When the clinic becomes the classroom, the analysand's act of speaking loses its pride of place. Where it goes, what happens to it, whether it's absent or otherwise, I think that's worth dialing in a minute. But for now, what we just need to know is that when the university discourse sets in, displacing the analytic discourse, and the clinic subsequently becomes a classroom, what gets lost, what drops out, is the analysand's act of speaking. It loses its pride of place. It finds itself out of place, the occupant of a place outside of that place known as the clinic, exterior to sense and nonsense alike, and in this sense absent. Very much as Badiou puts it, but again, you can tell, you can hear me edging in a slightly different direction. Okay, I think we're now in a position to reread once more that opening sentence in L'étourdi. The fact that one speaks remains forgotten behind what is said in what is heard, and again, supposedly understood. And to trace this reading through the discourse of the university when the clinic becomes a classroom. So take your discourse of the university. Take a look at this thing. I hold it up for those of you that are watching this lecture so that you can see it in front of you. In the position of truth, that S1, here you see what is said, namely the symptom. There's that S1 as symptom in analytic experience. Here we see what is said as a symptomatic statement. Here is that bit of nonsense. Above it, superior to it, in this perversion of analytic experience, we see what is heard and supposedly understood of what is said. So you can see we're backing into this sentence at the start of Lettordi. Notice also, though, the position of the analysand in all this barred subject. Here, the barred subject in the position of product. Analysand here is not the producer of speaking acts resulting in symptomatic statements. Here you see the analysand in the position of product. Yet another problem that occurs when the university discourse intrudes upon analytic experience. And then again, in between, in what we have been calling up to this point a delta of impotence, but that now is being raised to the status of a logical impossibility. Here we see the fact that one speaks, the front end of this sentence at the start of Lettordi. The fact that one speaks as something absent, forgotten, excluded from, subtracted from, made impossible by this configuration of analyst and analysand, symptom and knowledge, nonsense and sense. The act of speaking, the fact that one speaks, is forgotten behind what is said as trumped by what is heard. You see where we're going with this, right? What is heard trumps what is said, and what is said is the site behind which something of the fact of speaking is forgotten. There's a hierarchy here, and you'll note at the top of that hierarchy is the analyst's supposed knowledge of how the unconscious operates, that S2 in the commanding position of agent in the university discourse. That's why this discourse is so useful to understanding what Lacan is up to with this sentence. Hot damn. And all just because the analyst couldn't or wouldn't overcome their resistance to abjection. Yes, that is correct. Instead of accepting their ultimate status as the object supposed to go, recall our final lectures on Seminar 19B, they cling to their initial prestige, transferential through and through, as the subject supposed to know. And if you've seen our work on the discourse of the analyst and the position of that little abject little a in the commanding spot of the agent in that discourse, you know, and we've been rehearsing it in recent series, the 5 stages that an analyst would go through, starting from status as an avatar of the big other, the subject supposed to know, with all the answers to what might ail the so-called patient, all the way to the truth of their position, the ultimate outcome of their position, their function as little a, not as cause of desire, theirs or the analysand's, but as refuse, as a stone to be cast aside, as what Lacan at the end of Seminar 19B or worse calls a piece of crap. That is abjection. That is abject little a. Again, refer back to those concluding lectures and you'll see all of this spelled out. But that's what I mean when I talk about this transition from the subject supposed to know to the object supposed to go, as in go in the fucking trash. Yeah, that's where we're trending with all of this. It's a big ask. You've worked so hard. You've paid so much money. Look at all the diplomas on the wall. Look at all the time you've invested in study groups and cartels and advanced education and so forth. And now you have to play the part of a piece of shit? Trust me, it's understandable. Lacan understands it all too well. It's difficult to let go of that. But that is precisely what his theory and technique of psychoanalysis asks of the analyst. They must fall from their initial prestige as a subject supposed to know to their final status as refuse, as an object supposed to go. And that final status is the little a in abjection. Now, thankfully, analysts sometimes do indeed overcome their resistance to abjection. Turning the clinic into a classroom is not the only way that analysis unfolds. It's what happens when analysis goes astray. But thankfully, this isn't always what happens in psychoanalysis. When analysts play their part, and don't ever forget, my friends, it's just a part to be played. They allow and even will themselves to fall from grace, to fall from that prestige of the subject supposed to know as avatar of the big other with all the answers in a treasure trove, all too often referred to as the DSM. They fall through this position and 3 more developmental stages, which we've discussed at length, and ultimately into that position I was just describing, into the position of the semblance of abjection assigned to them by little a in the discourse of the analyst. Here again, it is not object little a, but abject little a. I can't emphasize this enough. I think it's a crucial turn in what Lacan is up to here. And it allows for big insights. So let's ask some questions and get us on the way. What becomes of sense, nonsense, and absense, knowledge, symptom, and living speech? What's heard, what's said, and the act of saying when this occurs? Namely, when the analyst can overcome their resistance to abjection. And let me tell you, shit goes down. Shit happens. And we need to figure out what it is. Sense, nonsense, absence, knowledge, symptom, living speech. What's heard, what's said, and the act of speaking. Get your pen and paper out. Sort them into these 3 columns. What happens to these 3 columns when the analyst plays their part, not as professor, but as piece of shit? Again, to illustrate this, to root this thing, recall the structure of analytic discourse, and be sure to write it out so you can see it in front of you. Not all y'all got this shit in your mind's eye. Not all of y'all got this shit tattooed on your forearm so you can consult it at any given time. Notice I don't push my fucking sleeves up on these calls. Again, recall the structure of the analytic discourse. I hold it up on the screen for those of you watching this lecture so you can see how this thing looks one more time. First and foremost, notice what's happening on the left, on the side of the analyst. The analyst's supposed knowledge of the truth of the unconscious remains separate from and subordinate to their semblance of abjection, and thus open to interrogation, revelation, and revision, all in light of the analysand's symptomatic statements. There's that arrow from S1 to A. Those symptomatic statements come flowing in, perforating the analyst's supposed knowledge of how the unconscious works. Here, the analyst's knowledge no longer trumps the analysand's symptom, but instead adjusts to it, adapts to it, integrates its nonsense instead of trying to eradicate it. Note that move. The job in the analytic discourse is to integrate the nonsensical symptom, not eradicate it, not suppress it, not subordinate it to preformed, supposed knowledges about how the unconscious works. And there's more to this, you might expect. Indeed, Lacan says as much in his iconic 19th seminar on or worse. When analysts overcome their resistance to abjection, they come to accept that they are sons and daughters of discourse, and bound, Lacan says, accordingly, to the barred subjectivities that they encounter body to body in analysis. which is why in our last series I emphasized once more this notion of Mitdasein from Heidegger. We queued it up in our series on Seminar 16. It's been with us ever since. Being there with, Mitdasein. Being there with another living subject. This has been our primary stake in understanding analytic experience since our series on Seminar 16. The structure is withness. So Freud makes a big deal about what we do mit den Trieben, with the drives. Lacan is here asking what the analysand does with the abject analyst. There's a with structure that happens in analytic experience when each participant embraces their status as a body engaged in a one-on-one encounter with another body, encore, again and again, in-person, in-body. What emerges is a being there with each other in embodied form. And the technical word for that we have been using from Heidegger's 20s work is Mitdasein, being there with. If you want a fancier term from microsociology, you could call it co-presence. That also works here. Lacan's point is that something is lost when the body-to-body encounter that typifies analytic experience passes over into Zoom. Now, he ain't talking about Zoom, but I'm talking about Zoom in the midst of all this. And I'm also doing so via recorded lecture appearing on your screen. You ain't here, and I ain't there. In an age when it's so easy to watch this shit on a screen, to listen to it through your earbuds as you're walking through the street, and it's easy enough for me to just sit here at my desk yammering at a device that stares back at me only with an image of myself, shit, where are you in all of this? You ain't here, which is exactly why I'm thinking about being there with. Now, I didn't come to talk to you all about that. We covered that shit in Seminar 16. We queued it up at the end of our last series. You can go check it out there. What I want to focus on is what this allows for, this being there with, in analytic experience. It allows the analyst to give the analysand what Lacan calls a bit of a push in the direction of interpreting. Now, for those of you that attend our fortnightly get-togethers where clinicians and scholars and students and independent learners, even motherfuckers from all over, got a new time zone and a different language for almost everybody on these calls. I absolutely cherish these sessions. One of the questions that has often come up is, what is this bit of a push? What indeed is the vector of addressivity extending from the position of the analyst as abject little a to the analysand as /s, barred subject, castrated speaker? What is the nature of that bit of a push in the direction of interpreting? Now, the clinicians on these get-togethers have had a lot of different answers to this. One that I'm particularly fond of is waiting until the analysand is stumbling right into it, onto it, and then just a little of the shoulder, just a little nudge, but not until they're stumbling right over the interpretation. Now, I didn't come to talk to you about that either. We are chomping at a bit that's going to put us in a different direction. My point is that when you have this one-on-one bodily encounter, encore, this nudge becomes a little bit easier, but don't hear it literally. And remember, all of this is just by way of review. If this shit sounds weird and wonky to you, well, it is. But absolutely go back and review these materials. You want to know more about all this? Check out the final 2 lectures in our series on Seminar 19B or worse. Just recorded them, just treated them, just discussed them with the group just a few weeks ago. So they're fresh in my mind, and I want them to be fresh in yours as we find ourselves in this new essay, L'étourdi. But what's new in all this? What's new here for us, or at least in sharper focus now that we've begun this essay, is what's happening on the right-hand side of the analytic discourse. So seminar 19b ends by focusing on the analyst. Now we're in L'étourdi, and we are looking at the right-hand side, asking about that speaking subject. On the right-hand side of the analytic discourse, notice what's happening. And all because the analyst overcame their resistance to abjection. I'll tell you what's happening once more. The barred subject in the production of symptomatic statements speaks. This is what happens in analytic discourse when the analyst, by embracing abjection, can stave off the university. The analysand can speak. And not just in any old way, but symptomatically. Here is that vector from barred S to S1 in the analytic discourse. It is a vector of active, emergent, and arguably even evental speech. Between the one who spoke, barred subject, and whatever the fuck they said, there's that S1, there is an act of saying. The same act of saying that becomes impossible when the clinic devolves into the classroom, allowing the university discourse to set in. I hope this is becoming clear to you now. So you see, in the university discourse, the analysand's act of speaking remains forgotten behind what they've said, as suppressed by what the analyst thinks they heard and now purports to understand. That's what you see in the university discourse when it intrudes on clinical experience. In the analytic discourse, however, the analysand's embodied, living, twitching, squirming, sweaty act of speaking nonsense takes center stage, blasting holes of inexistence into the analyst's supposed sense of how the unconscious works. And I want you to note my use of the term inexistence here. Lacan has been queuing this one up alongside this other notion of existence, ex-sistence. They are not the same. Even in L'étourdi, there are some moments where Lacan's kind of slipping in between the two. I do not think, conceptually speaking, that these are the same term. Existence is the real. Inexistence is its name. Lacan is very good and crisp about this in the early part of Seminar 19b or worse. We've got lectures on this topic. You can check it out. But for now, just put a pin in these terms and notice how I'm using the one in existence here. In the analytic discourse, the analysand's embodied, living, twitching, squirming, sweaty, squirting, crying, you see all the fluids, act of speaking nonsense, it's all on display. And its display blasts holes of inexistence into the analyst's so-called sense of how the unconscious works. Inexistence is the name of the real, the name assigned to it in the matheme, and the name it takes at the level of the symptom, if you recall back to our series on Seminar 18. We are not yet talking about existence. We're not talking about the real yet. We're talking about its name. And that's important. What is absented along the way? If the analysand's symptom is nonsense, nonsense to which the analyst's sense of the unconscious gives way, where do we find this much discussed absence in the analytic discourse? on the other side of the interpretive wall. One part hearing and one part understanding that stretches in this discourse from symptom to analyst, S1 to abject little a. I hold it up again just to show you this. From S1 as symptom, what is said, to the position of the analyst as abject little a, where what is heard is presumably understood, if you keep toying with Lacan's sentence, this forms a wall of interpretation behind which something is absented. Between nonsense and sense, something absented falls out. At stake here is nothing other than the unconscious. Specifically, the unconscious truths that command the analysand to speak, and in speaking to state in the form of a symptom a multifaceted, wildly enigmatic, and wonderfully nonsensical object of inquiry, one part speaking and one part said. I think that's a great way to understand what the unconscious as S2 commands the subject as /S to do, is to produce a wildly enigmatic, wonderfully nonsensical object of inquiry that is one part speaking and one part said. What's external and exterior to the analysand, subtracted and absented from their waking life, turns out to be the very thing, a something which for them is nothing, that makes them speak, the unconscious, here represented by S2, in the left-hand quadrant, lower side, and S2 that commands the barred subject to speak, and in speaking, to pronounce symptoms. Notice carefully what I am doing here. I am characterizing the analysand's unconscious truth in the lower left-hand quadrant of the analytic discourse as absence, as the remainder of a disjunction between their nonsensical symptom and the analytic sense, the analyst's sense of how the unconscious works, between S1 and abject little a. This is going to become key. S1 equals nonsense, abject A equals sense, in order for us to understand that S2, the unconscious truth that commands the analysand to speak by way of this fifth vector, as absence. Now, I don't want to carry us too far afield, but I do want to remind you of one other thing here. I want to remind you at this point that the interpretive nudge we were just discussing, this nudge that allows the abject analyst to give the castrated analysand a little push towards interpreting, it is initially, and I believe crucially, but also if left for too long, hazardously, a nudge of hystericization. This is another element of review, but one that adds some clarity to what Lacan is up to at the start of Topology. We've been over this a lot in our recent series, and I don't have time to rehearse it all here, and you fucking don't want to hear it either. So let me be brief, with the idea being that you will also sit down with pen and paper and redraw the discourse of the hysteric. In fact, push pause right now, get out your piece of paper, and draw the discourse of the hysteric. So now you will have all three in front of you. You'll have the discourse of the university, the discourse of the analyst, and the discourse of the hysteric. Notice, we ain't talking about the master here. Not yet. Draw the discourse of the hysteric. It'll help to make sense of what I'm about to say. To hystericize a neurotic analysand is to empower them to address their symptoms, barred subject addressing S1. And to decipher via dialectization, as my man Bruce Fink puts it, the links between these symptoms and the unconscious truths that commanded them. There's the S2 in the position of product as unconscious truth. And let me remind you, also as an object for the analysand's surplus enjoyment. And that's the fucking dilemma when analysis hystericizes the neurotic subject. The neurotic subject finds themselves addressing their symptoms. I wonder why I said that. And exploring and establishing links, dialectical links, links in discourse between those symptoms and the unconscious truths that commanded them. But here's the trap. Those unconscious truths in the position of product in the discourse of the hysteric, they are in the position of surplus enjoyment as well. These are objects of surplus enjoyment on which the analysand gets hooked, addicted, and ever off on. This is what allows for interminable analysis, where the analysand just keeps coming back week after week with new symptoms and new ways of connecting them and establishing linkages with their unconscious truths. And oh my God, isn't it just amazing? This is the trap of that old Delphic maxim, know thyself, the one that Lacan takes apart in Seminar 19b, as did we in our series. Know thyself is bullshit. Important bullshit, but fundamentally fucking bullshit. Because it always operates at the level of surplus enjoyment. What we're getting off on is a different type of crumb, a morsel of real enjoyment. When the endless deciphering of the hystericized analysand doesn't find an end. Here again, I think we see the barrier between subject and symptom overcome, which is a good thing. Or at least bored through, and all in acts of speaking. So you've heard the dangers of the discourse of the hysteric. Here, though, is a benefit of this. That barrier between subject and symptom that we see coming up when clinic becomes classroom and the university discourse sets in, it's overcome when the discourse of the analyst allows the analysand to pass into that of the hysteric. And all by way of a redoubled act of speaking. They address what they've said as symptom and then ask through language, through discourse, about the linguistic connects, the signifying connections between those symptoms and the unconscious truths that commanded them. Let me just be clear, that's a lot of fucking talk. That's a lot of fucking speaking. And I don't want to just be clear, I want to be categorical here at this point. In analytic and hysteric discourses alike, the fact and the act of the analysand's speaking, they are not forgotten, they are foregrounded. And that's the big difference. They are not forgotten, but foregrounded. All right, one final word on the discourse of the hysteric, and then I promise I'll quit going on about it. If you've got this discourse in front of you, or if you can see it in your mind's eye, or if you've got it tattooed, I don't know, just above your kneecap, and you happen to be wearing shorts, note the bottom half. Little a separated from S2 by an impasse. In the discourse of the hysteric, you see little a in the position of truth and S2 in the position of product. And again, you see that impasse, that delta of impotence raised to the level of a logical impossibility. Breakage between them. Not a vector, but a barrier. A chasm that can't be crossed. What's this little a down there in the bottom left? It's the analyst as abject little a for our purposes. And note the other way that we can read S2 here, not just as the unconscious truths that commanded the analysand to speak, and in speaking to produce symptoms. Here you can see that S2 in its other sense, the other meaning it takes in analytic experience, namely not that of the unconscious truths of the analysand, but the analyst's supposed knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. S2 has that double meaning here, and it's important when you recall that there's a delta of impotence turned logical impossibility, a barrier between these two things. Because here, in the lower part of the discourse of the hysteric, what you see is the analyst radically divided and disjoined from the very thing that they're often tempted to lord over the analysand, their own fucking knowledge. So the discourse of the hysteric, when it sets in and extends out of analytic experience, is useful in this other way. Not only does it allow the analysand to double down on the centrifugal force of their own acts of speaking, but it also forces the analyst into a position where their supposed knowledge of how shit is supposed to work is now radically disjoined from them. Ain't no way over that mountain range. And with this final word on the discourse of the hysteric, unfortunately it's only, at least for now, I think we can add some captions to all of this. Now, let me be clear. You know I live in San Francisco, right? But I guess, well, I mean, maybe you can't tell, but I didn't grow up here. My roots are somewhere else, and sometimes you can hear it in my voice. They're in the hills of southern Indiana. That's another part of the United States, if you don't know. And here's how these roots incline me to put everything you've heard in this opening lecture on Liturgy together. When the university discourse intrudes on analytic experience, we see the knowledge of the analyst in the driver's seat. When analytic discourse corrects for this intrusion, the knowledge of the analyst now takes a back seat. And when the discourse of the hysteric emerges from that of the analyst, the knowledge of the latter gets kicked to the fucking curb. And note this. All of this is occurring in inverse proportion to the analysand's speech. So, when the university discourse intrudes on analytic experience, what do we see? We see an analysand divided from saying and said alike. Their said as symptom belongs on the side of the analyst in a suppressed subordinate position, and their act of saying, that motherfucker's gone. The fact and act of saying when the university discourse intrudes on analytic experience is forgotten. Take that next turn. When analytic discourse corrects for this, analysands are reconnected to their symptomatic saids by their embodied sayings. That's what you see in the analytic discourse, a barred subject with a direct line to their symptoms. That direct line is a vector of speech, of embodied, evental, emergent speech. Here what you see is the fact of saying recalled. So in the university discourse, the fact of saying is forgotten. In the analytic discourse, the fact of saying is recalled. And in the discourse of the hysteric, this is how I would wind it up. What you see are analysand's sayings and saids alike, linked up with the unconscious truths that commanded them all. Here you see the fact of saying redoubled. From barred subject to S1, but also from S1 to S2. University discourse, the fact and act of saying is forgotten. Analytic discourse, the fact and act of saying is recalled. And when the analytic discourse hystericizes a neurotic subject, allowing the discourse of the hysteric to set in, this recollection is redoubled. And that, my friends, in the spirit of the hysteric, makes for a lot of speech events.